Good afternoon for everyone calling in, and thank you again for joining ThreatX's live Q&A, talking with our experts Neal Bridges and Jeremy Ventura about giving thanks to the CISO. So we've purposely designed this webinar to be as interactive as possible. We'll be stopping along the way to answer questions that come up in our chat, so please, by all means, do not be shy. And with that, we'll hop on in and we'll officially meet the experts. So today, helping me lead our session is Neal Bridges, CISO at Query.AI. Neal has over 20 years of experience in offensive, defensive, response, and even detection, threat hunting strategies. Again, over 20 years of experience, and also hosts his own YouTube series, Cyber and Security. So Neal Bridges, feel free to hop on and say hi.
Thanks. Glad to be here. And for those who have not been in a stream where I've been around, you know me, I love questions. And so, Sydney, thank you so much for keeping the Q&A open. And I'm super excited to hear what kind of questions the audience has. Super excited to answer yours, Jeremy's, and the audience's.
Perfect. And of course, we are also joined by Jeremy Ventura, our own senior field CISO here at ThreatX. Jeremy spends his time on podcasts, doing blog posts, also speaking at public events, and generally helping out the ThreatX folks with understanding the challenges that are associated with cybersecurity. So Jeremy, hop in and say hi.
Yeah, thanks, Sydney. Excited to be here with yourself and the man, the myth, the legend, Neal Bridges as well. So looking forward to this.
We're down low profile today. Keeping it easy.
Awesome. Before we get kicked off and hop into the session, which we're super excited about, my name's Cindy Cafaro. I'm a product expert here at ThreatX, focused on a number of cybersecurity solutions, but specifically API and application security. So with that, we will go ahead and we'll hop on in. To really help us get the conversation started, the first piece that I want to acknowledge is that, of course, companies are going through the struggle. The existing economic climate is definitely heading towards more uneasy times. But before we discuss that, I want to begin with the positive side of what we're thankful for. So Neal, based on your experience, what do you feel is actually going right for CISOs?
First of all, I'm glad that we're doing a positive kind of stream, and this is something I know we talked about when we were prepping for this. We do a ton of complaining as it is already about CISOs. We do a ton of complaining as CISOs. You know, there's never enough budget. People don't care about what it is that we're doing, and then obviously that same type of misery has a tendency to trickle down to folks on our team. And so I do want to start by saying that there is actually a ton to be really grateful for. And there is a lot of positivity to the CISO role and to a lot of the work that they're doing. And first and foremost, I think it really boils down to the patience that that senior leaders inside of cybersecurity have because of the challenges that they have to deal with, right? For all the complaining that you can think about doing in cybersecurity, think about the level of patience that's required to be able to continue to muster through and to be able to continue to push through and kind of drive through a lot of those challenges that you've got. And I mean, when we talk about challenges, like for those who are in bigger organizations, when I say bigger, I'm talking 150, 200,000 people, 200,000 digital assets across the enterprise. 100 and Fortune 100 type companies that are $50 to $100 billion. Getting an EDR project done in a year is almost an act of some form of divinity to try to get it done. The level of patience that you have to have as you go across the business, get that business buy-in from desktop engineering, get business buy-in from the users who are going to have yet another agent on their endpoint, getting business buy-in from the CIO and the board of directors for the $5 million project that you're going to have to deploy EDR out to your organization. And so there's a ton of that patience and a ton of that understanding that we're only in this job for a certain amount of time. And so we've got to try to make as big of an impact as possible. And that oftentimes requires a ton of patience and a ton of perseverance. And so I want to start off by saying to all the senior leaders who are listening to me right now, thank you for that level of patience and perseverance, because without you, the cyber economics of what it is that we do would be in a much worse place than it is right now.
Yeah, that's great, Neal. I think one key phrase you said there was buy-in. I think, while in the industry, we still have a long way to go to continue to improve on that buy-in with different senior C-level executives and other business departments within our organization. we're still seeing a positive increase as far as now communicating, where we're starting to see CISOs at the board level or sponsoring boards. Sydney, myself, and some of the ThreatX team was actually just last week in San Francisco for an OWASP conference. And while it's not always security focused individuals that attend these trade shows, we had a lot of solution architects, software engineers. And when we start talking about security, that conversation is starting to happen now too, more and more, where yes, I'm, designed to build product for my company. However, I need to keep security in my mindset when I go through everything that I do. So I think the buy-in from C-level executives and how they're getting buy-in now with different organizations and different business leaders is super important and a positive that we've been seeing in the industry.
Yeah, and I think it goes to speak to, one of the things that I've railed on in the past before, right, is that the folks that we've had in senior leader positions don't understand the business enough to be able to get the right level of buy-in. And so they come to the executive tier and they're like, we need to have X. And the business is like, why? And we as cybersecurity people go, adversary bad, ransomware bad, must do X, right? And we're like Neanderthals coming in there trying to figure this thing out. And so I think we have gotten better. And that is one thing that I have noticed over the last couple of years, is that we have gotten better about recognizing that we need to have a business understanding. We need to be reading our company's 10Ks. We need to be understanding what our corporate strategies are. We need to be able to, appropriately articulate to folks. I say that as I stumble over my words about perfectly articulation. We need to be able to articulate to the business what the actual residual value to the bottom line is for any level of cybersecurity strategy or any level of cybersecurity buy-in. I saw a fantastic interview over the weekend where somebody was saying, instead of looking at cybersecurity as a cost center, if you make widgets, you should be asking, how does this cybersecurity control help me make more widgets?
Interesting and really great insight being brought up there. I especially think through the years, cybersecurity has continued to become higher up on the priority list to executives. And I mean, by all means, the CISO is the pure driver of that. So couldn't have said it better myself. Thank you so much to both of you. Now, I think the next question is obvious. So help me with understanding, what are some of the inherent risks now associated with the CISO role?
And I thank you and Jeremy for not giving me any questions. So this gives me the opportunity to hopefully run over some of your future asked questions that you're going to have, because I have a tendency to get on a little bit of a tangent here. But I think we see something new happening with the Uber CISO kind of going through what it is that he's going through, right? And so for those who don't know, the former CISO of Uber, did some less than ethical things by allegedly did some less than ethical things by hiding the fact that they were breached, and they had effectively paid a ransom to some folks for that breach. And while I'm not a lawyer and I didn't sleep at a Holiday Inn last night, so I'm not going to speak to the legalities on all of it, I think the brand new risk that we do have to acknowledge is, if there's going to be a kind of a legal responsibility that's placed upon CISO's shoulders, much in the same way, and this isn't new for corporate, for those who aren't familiar with it, right? CFOs have a fiduciary responsibility, CEOs have a fiduciary responsibility, CIOs have a fiduciary responsibility. And a lot of these organizations, that top tier C level, has that same fiduciary responsibility and thus has that same legal protection. That's why you've got D&O insurance and directors and officers insurance and things like that protect the C-suite from those levels of lawsuits. But this is the first time that we've actually seen, kind of the CISO, kind of caught in the crosshairs, if you will, from a legal perspective. And while this one's criminal versus some of the ones that, the other folks that I mentioned could have to deal with, which are probably more civil, it at least opens the door up that there is not sufficient amount of legal protection surrounding CISOs for the decisions that they may make, be them criminal or otherwise. And so I think one of the new risks that we have, is an unknown legal landscape as to what protections a CISO has, what protections a CISO doesn't have when it comes to making strategic cybersecurity decisions. Then ultimately, those decisions will fail. I'm not here to say that those decisions will never fail, because we do play a game of wins, not ifs. Does that make them legally liable? And I think that that's a scary prospect for CISOs moving forward.
Yeah, I definitely think it's going to also, it could, turn off individuals that are,
Mhm.
looking to become a CISO one day, where now you've got all this liability in the role.
Mhm.
And to your point, you mentioned like CFOs, right? If you're doing tax evasion, or, CFOs and CEOs have always been kind of on the hook. And we've seen that in history, where they potentially will get a criminal conviction,
Mhm.
some type of conviction. But now as a CISO, where the mission was, let's keep the bad guys out of the castle, right? We're doing cybersecurity, but now there's potential liabilities into that role. Let's dig into this a little bit more, because I'd love to get your thoughts. Personally, so when I saw the news drop early October, I believe, when the convention came up, and I think is it up to 8 years, up to 5 years that individuals facing, instantly on LinkedIn and different social networks, I saw it was actually kind of 50-50, where I saw a lot of the CISOs bonding together pretty much and saying, okay, hold on, we need to look at this together as a community. And maybe the individual did not everything perfectly, but they were backing the individual up a lot. Versus you had kind of outside people that weren't necessarily CISOs or CIOs that were saying, whoa, like, you didn't disclose this breach. You offered through your bug bounty program, you hit it up. I think the general counsel was also involved. So, I saw this tear where in the community, where some people were like, and I don't know if it was more of the feeling of uncertainty. Okay, what is my role going to look like future? But kind of, not without going into your personal opinions, what was the aftermath like for you? Like, was there anything in your community where with your other individuals in your CISO network were discussing, what does this role look like? Or, the outcomes of that?
I think and it's hard not to intermix my personal opinions on this with because I think everybody's got a ton of personal opinions on this. I don't care where you try to stand on it. I think the general sense to people, we have a tendency in cybersecurity to be very optimistic when things happen, not realizing that there's a whole other mechanism that surrounds that optimism that may or may not necessarily exist. And I'll give you a case in point, right? You mentioned earlier when we talked about having, the SEC mandate that CISOs be on the board of directors moving forward. This actually came up in a conversation that we had at Query during our executive offsite last week, as we were just kind of talking about the motion of the industry. And I think people don't really realize that we're not all of a sudden going to see, the multi-billion-dollar board of Target or something like that point to the CISO and be like, guess what? You're on the board of directors now, right? I think what we're really going to see is we're going to see kind of the creation of almost this like subcommittee of cybersecurity that's kind of chaired by the CISO, that's made up of cybersecurity folks on it and maybe a few business folks on it, that become consulted during that board meeting. But to see a flat out board position, somebody get ousted from a board seat and having a CISO put in there, I just don't think that you're going to see happen for a good amount of time. And so it's we see the good in outcomes like this, and we see the potential positivity, but we forget that there's an entire mechanism. We talk about the devil being in the details. And so bringing it back around to the CISO, and the criminality, right? I'm a very huge believer in the criminal justice system, right? He was found guilty by a jury of his peers, so he clearly broke the law. The question becomes, are corporations seeing now that there needs to be protections in the same way that there needs to be protections for other corporate officers? Does general counsel need to be more in tune with the policies, the procedures, the incident response activities, what actually constitutes the materiality of a breach whenever that type of incident occurs? What are the mechanisms that kind of support a corporate legal system supporting a corporate CISO the same way that corporate legal system supports a CEO and a CFO and things like that? And I don't think that those mechanisms, I don't think we've realized what those mechanisms are going to be like yet in the wake of this aftermath. And I think that that's the level of unknown that the people who have positivity towards this, that's what they don't know the answers to.
Do you think, I want to get you on your soapbox here. Do you think there are so many regulatory compliance? Let's say you mentioned something that kind of stuck out to me about, disclosing a data breach, and depending on different geographical locations, industries, all this good stuff. Do you think the water's a little muddy? It's a little confusing because there's so many different types of compliance or regulatory aspects to this role, as an organization in general.
So regulatory is something that it always comes up in conversation. If you follow the crypto space, literally there's tons of regulatory conversations that are happening all around the crypto space right now. If you look at the finance sector, right, who's had to deal with regulatory concerns probably longer than any of us, you can see that they have, on one side of things, built a pretty robust cybersecurity engine over on the financial services sector side. They've got rules, they've got guidelines, they've got regulations. It doesn't stop breaches, but I mean, I go again, I test that if anybody's expecting to come into this industry and say, I'm going to be the one who stops all breaches, I'm sorry, but we've got to do a little bit of reality check with you. But they're doing a good job of maintaining the defensive posture of their financial organizations. And so I do generally think that regulation is a positive for our organization. Now that's the blanket statement. That's the blanket positive statement. I do also think that we struggle with and let's look at CCPA, right? So the California Privacy Privacy Act, right? California is the only one that generated one, and then you have some states like Maine, like New York, that may follow suit, but then you've got 40 some odd other states that have nothing. And so from a compliance perspective, now you have to juggle not just GDPR and CCPA, but you got to make sure that this state is in check, and then this state, and then, oh, by the way, Brazil's then going to come up with their privacy regulations, and then you're going to have India come in with theirs, and you're going to have to match that. And so I do think that there's an opportunity at the highest levels from an executive leadership perspective of a little bit of that compliancy fatigue, which is why if we get caught and speaking directly to folks who are in that senior leadership position right now, if you do try to chase a singular privacy, framework, if you do try to chase a single privacy, law like GDPR, CCPA, you're probably going to fall very behind, because you're going to be chasing little nuances as each of these new laws crop up, year in, year over time. And so, you do kind of have to find that framework that works for you. You do have to find the one that tries to cover as many of your customer bases as possible. Really have to try to implement the ones that you're regulatory required to, because you're in some type of regulated industry. I know that may sound like the answer to your question is yes, but I think it's more that we have a maturity curve to learn into, where it's like, do we need 50 different privacy policies, or do we just need one? And I think that we have to go through this pain first before we get to the epiphany of the realization.
Now, Neal, I have a question from you from one of our audience members, Mark. So Mark, thanks so much for posting your question. How would you go about suggesting a liability piece? Like, would you suggest a personal liability insurance? Because lawyers can definitely be expensive.
Yeah, I have a love-hate relationship with every lawyer that I've ever come in contact with, because while I may not have paid for my lawyers in corporate America, they still came at the price of sitting in numerous amounts of boring corporate lawyer meetings. I have not gone out and gotten a personal liability insurance personally. Maybe I like to live on the edge, call it what you will. I don't think that this judgment is so significant that everybody should run out and get personal liability lawyers by any stretch of the imagination. I'm definitely not saying that. I think, if anything, continuing to watch it, I think having a conversation in your organization with general counsel, with your legal team, talk to them about what they perceive that legal case means to them for you in your particular leadership role. Ask, very much in the transparency conversation, have that conversation at the leadership level with your boss, with general counsel, potentially with the CEO, if you can get the CEO in there as well, and talk about an opportunity to bring that role into the corporate, liability coverage, type of arena. I think at a minimum is the right way to start having that conversation. I don't think you need to run out and get a personal liability lawyer. I'm not a lawyer, I didn't play one on TV, so that's not legal advice, but I would absolutely use it to have a conversation. As a matter of fact, that's what I've done, since my job here at Query. Is I've engaged, our CEO and our outside counsel to make sure that, we've talked about what that liability coverage means for somebody like myself.
Perfect. And one more question from the audience for yourself, Neal. Being in the CISO role, managing so many initiatives, potential breaches, new products, existing systems, how do you go about prioritizing what is most important?
So first I want to say thanks to Mark and Miro for these questions. I really appreciate it. And again, that, you know, for everybody else who's listening, who's like, do we do questions? Yes, we're totally doing questions. This should be your cue to be like, all right, cool, they're doing questions. Drop them into chat before it gets too late. You know, time management is hard, right? I'm not up here to tell you that I've got some like leet sauce mystical way that I solve all sorts of time management problems. And despite this, like this hustle poster here, I promise you, I'm not waking up at 4 a.m. and going to bed at midnight and telling you all that you have to like, sleep through life, or you're taking Adderall through life to get everything done. Time management is hard, right? Without a doubt. I definitely, and this is new terminology to me, and I'll give a huge shout out to Matt Eberhardt. Just came in, an incoming CEO of Query. He kind of brought this terminology up as we were discussing some of our product initiatives. He talked about the most important thing, and he talked about, he's using it obviously as we kind of look at what's the most important thing as we develop the product here at Query. But I started to take that language back and really kind of think to myself, like, as I'm looking to prioritize my life, as I'm looking to prioritize the things that I have going on, what are the most important things to me that I need to accomplish? And it's very similar to something that somebody told me on another piece of advice that somebody gave me a couple of years ago, which is, when you talk about not having time for stuff, instead of saying you don't have time to work out or go to the gym, reframe that statement and say it's not a priority to go to the gym. And you start to realize that it's not a priority and the most important thing are kind of related. And when you sit back and go like, okay, I've got these 10 things to do, what are the most important things for me to be doing? And you realize that maybe only 3 of those are the most important things to do. And so you have to do the most important things, and then you can find time for everything else. If it's not the most important thing, you should really kind of ask yourself, like, if it's not the most important thing, should you really be doing it? Is it kind of a nice to have? Is it a pipe dream? Is it something that maybe you just kind of have to let go out to pasture and die because, it's just not the most important thing to you? And you'll come to realize that, those same types of sacrifices that you have to make for your own personal initiatives are things that you have to deal with as a CISO inside of an organization. You're going to get people who are going to come to you with 50 different problems, and you're going to have to look across those and say, is this the most important thing to my organization? Is this the most important thing for the business? Is this something that I can take people away from other resources or other initiatives or other projects and move them over here to that? And once you realize that there's a correlation there between those, so I think you find managing all the things that you've got going on in your life, probably a little bit simpler.
Yeah, Neal, that's great. I think it kind of goes back to Sydney, to your original question too, about, what are we thankful for? To Neal's point, with life, our, personal life, but also trying to, stop evolving in fast techniques that are ever changing from wherever they're coming in from, nation states or just, attackers in general. It's tough, but having good people around you in everything in life also, makes a big difference, right? So Neal, question.
Yeah.
I'm going to keep it very open, and I want your opinions. Who should the CISO report to?
The CISO needs to report to somebody who you're not going to have a conflict of interest with, and somebody who can take more of that fiscal responsibility, if you will, for InfoSec decisions. And I want to kind of elaborate on that just a little bit. So that was kind of the blanket statement. I think the only wrong answer that I unequivocally find that the CISO should not report to would be a CTO or a CIO. And the biggest reasons why is because for years, for too long, the CISO has gotten the reputation of being a subset of IT. And so they've positioned the CISO in the tree of the CTO or the CIO, which traditionally holds most of the information technology assets inside of an organization. And so when that's the case, you have to remember that you may be reporting on a corporate tree to the CIO, but you're reporting quarterly to the board. And so if I go to the board and say, hey, look, this SAP server is probably going to get hacked because it hasn't patched the vulnerability, because IT hasn't patched the vulnerabilities in 4.5 years, and it's got 3, CVSS 10 vulnerabilities that are actively being exploited in the wild, and it's literally only a matter of time before we get popped. You know what you're doing? You're ratting on your boss. So while that might not seem like a big deal to the board, because the board's like, okay, cool, we now have an awareness of what our cybersecurity threat posture is. You think you're going to go back and you're going to have a nice cup of coffee with your boss, and boss is going to be like, so thanks for throwing me underneath the bus there with the board and telling them that I hadn't patched my SAP servers in 4.5 years. Your performance review is right around the corner. We're going to be looking at a needs improvement on that bad boy here pretty soon, right? So you innately have that conflict of interest where you can't talk about the risks to the organization without inherently throwing your boss under the bus. And so I think first and foremost, we've got to get it out from underneath people that we're going to just have a negative impact on their lives and who we have to even have a conversation of negotiation with before we go to the board of directors to report on risk as it is. And so with that being said, I think the only appropriate places, I think the only 3 appropriate places that a CISO can fit right now is either under general counsel, which is my least favorite option, underneath the CFO, because then you're on par typically with a CIO, and it becomes a financial decision as to whether you invest $5 million to upgrade the SAP server because of a vulnerability, or you own the fiscal risk of potentially getting a breach to your SAP system and however much that breach would cost you. The CFO is the one who has to make that kind of case to the board anyway, for that loss of revenue when that happens. Or last but not least, the CEO, having the CISO report directly to the CEO is also a potential option. Although I'm less solid on that one. I think the CFO is the right choice, but I think the big part is we've got to get it out from underneath the CIO. We've got to get it out from underneath the CTO.
What you just explained, Neal, the confrontation between how a CISO could work alongside some of the more technical C-level roles, something I've never even thought of. So thank you so much for kind of understanding and explaining some of those relationship dynamics I think some of us haven't considered before. I realize we're coming up on time, and the last question that I want to make sure I can ask both of you is, how do you see the CISO role evolving in the future?
Yeah, I'll start there. I thought Neal a little answered that or touched upon kind of some of the things too. I think the biggest thing is continuing to have the conversation. Neal, you said it best, but sometimes a negative event causes positive outcomes. Mm-hmm. And I think, while nobody wants a data breach, while nobody wants to be the next big one, it naturally is going to happen, right? Yeah. It's going to be somebody next tomorrow, then the next day, then the next day. And as a CISO working potentially for a company that may be in that same industry, or may have the same type of customer base or sell the same products, I think sometimes it's a kind of like an oh crap moment where they go, whoa, wait a second, maybe I should evaluate what am I doing to protect my VPNs or email security or APIs or whatever it might be. And so, I think as we continue to evolve, the conversation needs to continue to evolve as well. Everything we talked about before, right? We need to get business buy-in, continue to strive for that. I think it's also important, and it's also our responsibilities as security leaders to make sure that we're speaking the language that people know how to understand it. And we could probably do a whole segment, and I know we have in the past, about making sure we're communicating effectively and how we do that to make sure that we are communicating security terms for potentially like a marketing purpose or a financial purpose. So I think while it will get more challenging, I think kind of with the theme of Thanksgiving, it's still very important to stay positive, optimistic that the CISO role is still evolving. We are having conversations at the board level, and that will continue to grow as well. Neal, I'm not sure if you want to add on to that.
I think there's a ton to be positive for on this regard, right? I mean, and I can't even begin to tell you how excited I am. You talked about it from, how do we influence the industry? And I applaud you for that perspective. I guess I look at the positivity, and when I talk about being thankful for CISOs out there, the world is changing around us. And when we talk about the world changing around us, we could talk about everything from what's happening in Ukraine all the way to Web3, right? And all this new innovation that's happening around blockchain and the crypto space and things like that. And I know crypto is kind of an icky word sometimes when we talk about it in cybersecurity. But if you look at some of the innovations that's happening on blockchain, people are doing some crazy innovative stuff on blockchain that's literally going to change the face of how we use the internet. Whether you like it or not, there's to your point, Jeremy, there's probably an entire stream that we could do on, this mentality that we need to be, looking out for some of these technologies. But I think that the point I was trying to make is there's an opportunity here for all CISOs to continue to push themselves into new areas. Like what you may be used to from a cybersecurity perspective may have worked for the last 5-ish or so years. But I think that this industry is continuing to change, is going to continue to change, and it gives you an opportunity as a CISO to literally be leaning forward and leaning into new technologies. We may not like zero trust, we may not like XDR, but you can at least lean into it enough to where you can understand the good, the bad, you can read between the lines, and then you can help make it the industry, different. I've seen some changes out of Gartner. If you know me, I'm pretty harsh on Gartner, Forrester, as a rule. But they're at least starting to ask some different questions about, like, what is this XDR technology, and does it make sense for us to be having all of these folks in XDR, so that we could try to avoid some of the pitfalls that we've got on that technology, naming perspective moving forward. And so I think that the industry is still so, I don't want to call it revolutionary, but it does feel very revolutionary, where new things are happening all the time, that if you're a board CISO, or if you've got like one playbook that you think you just come into any organization, that playbook is just going to magically, get you your 3 years, get you your 20% pay bump, and then you're going to roll on over to your next one, and you're going to take your playbook there. I think you're on the cusp of being outdated and, without a job, because the industry is just moving too far and fast around you.
Yeah, no, that's a perfect segment. I know we're kind of running up on time. That is I think, just a perfect positive outcome to look at as we kind of wrap this up. And before I turn it over to Sydney to wrap it up, Neal, I want to say thank you, first of all, from Sydney, myself, the entire ThreatX team. But in addition to that, in the light of Thanksgiving, we as a community want to say thank you to you. We know that you've done a lot for individuals trying to get into cybersecurity or trying to evolve their careers. In addition to, I know you do a lot for schools and education community, and also veterans. So on that behalf, from the entire ThreatX team, one, we say thank you. But in addition to that, we'd also like to make a donation to a charity of your choice for Thanksgiving here. So once again, speaking on behalf of the entire community, thank you very much, Neal, for everything you've done.
Thank you, guys. I appreciate it.
Couldn't be more thankful. Thank you, Neal, for the time with us. And Jeremy, thank you so much for this really insightful and great session. We couldn't have done it without the both of you. I know we only have, or we're a little bit over time, but again, I wanted to thank everybody for joining us. Please check out Neal Bridges' Cyber Insecurity YouTube channel. He has tons of great content on there related to hacking conversations, career advice, the latest news in cybersecurity. And if you enjoyed the session today, join us for the next live Q&A December 8th with Mike Prevet, CISO at Passport and owner of Return on Security blog, talking about the predictions for threats in 2023. So thank you all again for joining, and we hope you had a great time.